Anyway, we're going to talk about what to do to try to create some big bass in your pond. Actually, I think on the program may be listed as trophy bass, but I don't really like to use that word trophy bass because it's not well defined. You know, what is a trophy to me might not be a trophy to you, or vice versa. So what we like to think about here is what do we have available to us to grow big fish, big bass. I'm going to start off talking about new lakes. Dr. Higginbotham has gone over a lot of things that we look at and that we use as management tools for existing lakes. But there are many people who are putting in new ponds, and if you start out in a new lake and you want to produce bigger bass, you have a much better chance of doing that than you do a lot of times in an existing lake if you don't have a good bass structure in that lake to begin with. Now, you know, one of the things to think about is this: how did these guys come up with how many fish I'm supposed to put in my new lake? How did they come up with the number of bluegill I'm supposed to stock and the number of bass I'm supposed to stock? Well, it's kind of interesting. We got a little history from Michael Masser earlier about some of the work that was done at Auburn University, but that wasn't the only place that people were interested in learning how to stock lakes. George Bennett up in Illinois was also working on this about the same time, and they used a lot of different techniques and different combinations to try to figure out what to use. Dr. Swingle, of course, we refer to him as the godfather of pond stockings. And not only did he try to figure out what kind of combination to use, but he went through several years there trying to figure out what species to put in combination with largemouth bass. And they used shiners to begin with, and other minnows, and then they used red ear and red breast and a number of other sunfish species to put in combination with largemouth. But like Dr. Master said, and Dr. Higginbotham referred to, you can't get away from bluegill as a base forage or food for your bass, because they spawn about every month through the summer, starting either in May or June, and will spawn through September and sometimes October in this area right here. So they're all the time producing offspring that's going to go for food for these bass. So they did settle on a bass bluegill combination, and this seemed to be the best of two species in order to continue to provide enough food to keep these largemouth bass growing. And one of the things that they discovered was that it appeared like in the late 1940s and early 1950s that a 10-to-1 ratio of bluegill to bass resulted in what they called at that time a balanced population. Okay? Not many of you in here would recognize this picture, but this is a picture of Dr. Homer Swingle. I was one of the ones that was probably very fortunate to have had Dr. Swingle as a professor. I took one of the last courses that he taught before he quit teaching over there. It was a graduate course, and I was able to sneak in as an undergraduate in there. But we've actually developed pond management strategies and protocols based on what Dr. Swingle did back in the late 1940s and 1950s. And so that's been a long time ago. And things have changed in some ways since then. But you'll still find that a lot of state agencies started their pond programs in the early 1950s, and this was because of several factors. But one was that there weren't the amount of public reservoirs we have today. The second factor was that there was a federal program that came open, a Dingell-Johnson program, that provided funds to state agencies to encourage them to develop private waters so that people could fish in those. Well, when Dr. Swingle was involved with this thing, that's what he was interested in also, but from a little different aspect, not just from the recreational aspect, but he wanted to provide some food for a lot of rural farm owners to have as a source of protein. And so this is where some of this came from. But basically the program was this: you got a 10-to-1 stocking ratio of bluegill to bass, and it didn't really matter what kind of fishing you wanted. This is what you had to start out with. Dr. Swingle was looking at this thing as a possibility of adding some additional source of protein. Because, you know, back in those days, in the late 40s and early 50s, a lot of the rural farm owners, they raised their own pork, they raised their own beef, they had their own chickens, you know. And then the government would provide them a little money to build a pond, stock watering pond that they could stock fish in, and they had fish to catch. We looked at this thing. If you look at some of the older publications, you'll see what was actually in their minds during the 1950s, and that was something we call maximum sustained yield. Otherwise, how many fish can you catch out of that pond and have it remain in balance? How much can you catch and eat out of there and still have the pond continue to be in balance? So this is one of the things you look at, and if you looked at that, at some of those publications, it'll tell you you can harvest 150 pounds of bluegill per acre and 40 pounds of bass per acre. But when you go back and do a little checking on there, you find that what they determined was harvestable size was 6 to 7 inches on a bluegill and about 10 inches on a bass. Well, that's certainly not what we're looking at today. So a lot of things have changed since the 1950s, and one of those is the fact that expectations are a lot higher than they used to be back then, because one of the reasons is that fishing now is primarily for a sport, not for food. So all of these farm ponds and smaller ponds and lakes that are built now are built for sport fish management. And I know that back when I was a kid, I was pretty well influenced by fishing with my grandfather. I tell you, I used to look forward to coming and spending a week with my grandpa Bud in the summertime, because he would take me fishing almost every day. And I remember one morning that we got up real early to go fishing, and we went out to the barn and we knocked down a nest of red wasp, and we used those larvae in there for bait. And we grabbed us 2 cane poles with some quills on them. We threw them in the back of that old pickup truck, and we drove about a mile down a dirt road to Deacon Jones's pond. We got down there, we didn't have an ice chest. Well, we didn't even have any ice. We didn't have a stringer. We didn't have a sack. My granddad taught me how to make a stringer out of a piece of willow limb. You take a long, thin willow limb, take all the leaves off of it, and cut the trunk off about this far on that willow limb, and then you thread that thin limb through the gills and out the mouth, and then you just stuck that limber end in the mud in the bank, and that was your stringer for your fish. So we had a pretty good morning that morning. I remember we had a lot of bluegill up 6 to 7 inches, had a couple of 10-inch bass, and it was fairly warm. All those fish were dead by the time we got ready to go home. We took that stringer and we threw it in the back of the truck and drove up to the house. My grandpa Bud got that stringer. By that time, all these fish were kind of sliding pretty good, you know. We opened the front door and walked right through the living room carrying that stringer with slime dripping off of it. Got into the kitchen. We threw those fish into the sink. He called my grandmother, Carly. Carly, we want these fish for breakfast. And my grandmother got in there and got those fish, and she scaled them and cut the heads off those things and fried them, and we had a pot of grits to go with them. Man, I tell you what, I thought that was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. My Pa Bud was my hero. A number of years later, I tried that on my first wife. We're talking about bass and bluegill stockings in the new ponds and numbers per acre and ratios. And this is typical what we see. I mean, we've already seen this today. We're looking at a 10-to-1 stocking ratio, either 1,000 bluegill and 100 bass per acre, or 500 bluegill and 50 bass per acre. One of the things that we've been looking at over the last 10 years is in order to manage for bigger bass, we have challenged that paradigm of stocking at a 10-to-1 ratio. We've actually come in and changed that ratio from a 10-to-1 to a 20-to-1 or higher. We've even stocked as high as a 30-to-1 ratio. There's been a little bit of research done on this thing at Auburn University, looking at changing that ratio and how that develops. But what we're actually doing here is we're changing the dynamics of this lake or this pond in order for these bass to have more food and to grow at a faster rate. Now, this doesn't necessarily, if you were to do PSDs on this, or look at some other values, this wouldn't be exactly in the little tic-tac-toe chart that you've got on the back of your book. But what we've seen is that this is typically what we see. When you stock at a 10-to-1 ratio of bass to bluegill, you don't have to read these numbers. That's not the important part. What I want you to look at here is this is a length distribution of bluegill at about age 2. Okay, you've got some really nice bluegill in here, up to 10 inches. Shell cracker the same. But when you look at this population, you look here at 5 inches and look down here, there are no fish in there. There's no small fish for these bass to eat in there because we're already getting into a bass crowded situation at age 2. This is typical of what we see. You'll see what we as scientists or biologists call a bimodal distribution. That's where you get a big peak here of small fish that are typically in the 8 to 9 inch range, and you get another peak out here of fish that are typically in the 11 to 14 inch range. When you see this, and if you were to look at your WR relative weight values on these things, you would see already that these things have values probably in the 80s. This is at age 2. So if you want to develop a good lake that's going to be a good bass lake, then we recommend changing your stocking ratio. I mean, I can tell you this for sure. I know that if Dr. Homer Swingle were here today, or had been here for the last 20 years, he would have already discovered this. But he's not. And in the meantime, we've been using what he found in the 1950s as what we want to go on. You look at this at age 2, and you see a big wide distribution of bass with a lot of fish out here that are over 16 inches long. That's the kind of bass distribution we would like to see in some of our lakes, and we do that as a result of stocking that higher stocking ratio. You'll also see here that you've got a large number of bluegill in this population that are 4 to 5 inches long. Now those fish are what sustains that growth on those bass. You've got to have large numbers of the proper size food, as Dr. Higginbotham pointed out, and Dr. Master, in order for these bass to continue growing at a rapid rate. We found by changing this ratio that we can average 2 pounds of growth on a bass a year, not just for the first year or the second year or the third year or the fourth year, but we're carrying this on out. And in addition to that, especially initially, we're able to reduce the numbers of fish per acre or pounds of fish, bass that we need to harvest in order to maintain this. It's not as hard to do. Now, we typically do this, of course, in combination with some other forage, but this stocking rate increases the number of 3 to 5 inch bluegill, and there are lots of other things here biologically that I'd like to tell you that happens in the dynamics of this thing, but I don't really have time to get into that. But suffice it to say that by stocking this higher ratio, you end up with a lot more smaller bluegill that are in the range that your bass need to eat. So what we've seen also is that we get a decrease, not necessarily in bass spawning, but we get a decrease of what we call recruitment. That is the survival of your bass pond, and your bass population doesn't tend to accumulate large numbers of small bass, which tends toward crowding. And what we're really looking at, I think, as far as pond owners, is that we want a young, fast-growing bass in our lake. This is what we're looking at. The key to this thing, of course, is having the right amount of the right size forage. You've got to have food, and more food in order to get this 10 pounds of food for each bass. Now, the one thing that to think about is you don't have to produce that 10 pounds all at one time, because you got these fish growing and producing food for you. So this is something that's accumulated throughout the year. But one of the things that we've talked about was a threadfin shad. That's an excellent additional forage to these lakes. Our experience has been if you want to grow bass, bigger bass, you need to add something besides bluegill to that. Bluegill's the mainstay. You can't replace bluegill, but you can supplement these with different fish. Threadfin shad, golden shiners, and of course, one of my favorites is tilapia. Tilapia are a wonderful forage species. along with these others. The real nice thing about tilapia is that in the fall, when that water temperature starts dropping, those tilapia become kind of lethargic. It's easy for these bass to catch, and they really fatten up in the fall. One of the things that we had talked about was female bass, and there are some occasions to stock all females. One of the obvious advantages to doing that is that you don't get any bass reproduction because you've only got one sex, and it's kind of hard to have babies if you just have one. Second thing is that these females all have trophy potential because males typically don't reach trophy size. In fact, if you catch a male that's 5 pounds in size, as a comparison to you deer hunters, that's a boon and crop. Most males don't ever get out of the 4-pound range, and a lot of them never achieve that size. So you've got all trophy potential in stocking females. And then you can control the numbers of bass that you have in that lake each year by supplementally stocking additional females in there so that you really have tight control over that population and you can really grow some fish. And also, there's no harvest necessary. Once you get this thing going, you don't need to harvest. You don't need to worry about selective harvest to take out any bass because you don't have any reproduction. You keep what you want in there, and it's kind of a catch and release situation. Now, is this a practical thing to do? Well, you know, there are a lot of ways to create these females, but from a practical standpoint, the best way we've found is that we know we've got 100% females, is to go ahead and individually check each one. But there are some other techniques. There's a genetic technique called gynogenesis that can produce all females, and then, as we mentioned in the genetics part of the talk, there's a way that you can produce these things using hormones. In stocking these females in the lake, one of the things that we do in here is that we like to stock that forage in and let it run for a whole summer, so that we really build up a really high population of forage in there. And then we come back in the winter or the early spring of the next year, and we'll take fish that are probably 8 to 10 inches long. We sex those by tubing, and we place those in, usually during the late winter or very early spring. And we've done this in a number of lakes, although we have a limited number of bass that we can stock out. We had done these in a number of lakes, and we've achieved growth rates of 3 to 4 pounds per year. Now you think, gosh, that's a lot. Well, I'm going to tell you, bass can grow a lot faster than you think. I mean, if you're used to a typical pond where you grow 1 pound a year and the next year you got 2 to 3 pound fish, a bass can make that size, can gain 3 to 4 pounds in a year. We have fingerling bass that can gain, actually, we've had several lakes that we've stocked as a 2-inch fingerling in June, and in the end of October, these things weigh 2 pounds apiece. They have that potential, but they're typically, just like Dr. Higginbotham said, they're limited by food. They're limited by food supply. If they didn't have to work very much for that food, and they were able to get as much as they could eat, they could grow at a tremendous rate. It's just almost unreal how fast these things can grow. One of the things that we've seen in these things is that there are really not all that many people who really want to create what I call a trophy bass lake. I'm talking about lakes that have bass in there that are going to be 8 pounds plus. Most people think they want that, but they don't really want that. And the reason is because they're just like Dr. Higginbotham. He don't want to fish. He wants to catch something. And if you don't have very many bass in there, your catch rate is low. And the other problem with this is that, just like we had talked earlier, is that pretty soon, actually in a very short period of time, you can actually attain your maximum carrying capacity of that pond in bass. So can we produce a pond full of 10-pound bass? Well, if your carrying capacity is only 50 pounds per acre, it's going to be a real difficult thing to do because you can't have very many 10-pounders in there. 5 fish per acre. That's not many to fish for. So one of the things you have to think about is if you really want to have a lot of big bass in there, you're going to have to go to great lengths to feed these things and produce this. You're going to have to max this thing out as much as you can, produce as much food as possible And then in addition to that, you're probably gonna need to add some more fish to it. Because more than likely, you're not gonna be able to produce enough to support the bass that you think you want to support in there. So with having all females in there, you can really have some fish like this, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to get to that point. I can tell you that this is a 25-acre lake that we stocked with all females, and that's a fish, that's an F1 that came out of that lake right there. She actually was just caught in the lake and put back. But one of the complaints we had on that lake was that I know this is real good, but my kids have been out there fishing 3 or 4 times, they can't catch anything. You take 2 experienced anglers out there, and I put 2 on that lake. They caught 20 bass that weighed between 5 and 10 pounds in 4 hours. Kids couldn't catch anything. These guys were big bass fishermen. So we've got another lake over on St. Simon's Island, Lake Frederica, 150 acres. 2 years ago, they had a 6-boat tournament on that lake. Last place in the 6-boat tournament, last place, 32 pounds for 5 fish. The winning boat, you do the math. Ray Scott would like to have had that. So can we create a lake full of big 10-pound bass? Yeah, theoretically you can, but it's very difficult in practice to do that. So you have to define your goals, what you want. You know, you can be like Billy says, you know, changing your stocking ratios and doing what we're talking about to manage big bass isn't for everybody. Because some people like to catch bluegill. Some people just like to catch fish. And if you do, changing your stocking ratios from a 10 to 1 is not the thing to do. So whatever you do, you know that management is important, very important. Supplemental forage is very important. And anything you do requires management to be successful. So you've got to think about fertilization that we've talked about, weed control, selective bass Rs, feeding, all those things that Dr. Higginbotham pointed out are things that you're going to have to do in order to manage your lake for big bass. Now, I'll tell you, I didn't include this in the genetics part of our program here because I was a little bit afraid to show these guys in Texas what we're working on. What the heck, I'm fixing to leave. And we're working on a new prototype fish here. We've got just a few things to work out on this thing, but I tell you, it's really good.